Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford, Chapter 6, read by Fiveum. Anti-Elitism and the New Class Warfare, opening with the following quote.
Organized discontent. That is our strategy.
From Howard Phillips of the Conservative Caucus. Clinton Rossiter, in the second edition of his book Conservatism in America, wrote in 1962 that throughout recent history conservatives had been
skeptical of popular government,
drawing support from men
who have a sizable stake in the established order.
The left, he said in contrast, is made up of those who
demand wider popular participation in government
and
draw particular support from the disinherited, dislocated, and disgruntled.
In little more than a decade, his description has been turned on its head. Rossiter's 1962 description of leftists would apply in the early 1980s more to the new right than to the left. Howard Phillips told me that the goal of the right is
to organize discontent.
That is, to mobilize the disinherited, dislocated, and disgruntled. Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress said the new right is a
middle-class
revolt against an
elitist upper class.
The new enemy to these angry middle Americans and to the practical politicians, journalists, and pundits who articulate their anger is the elite, the established, the affluent, the cultivated intellectual. In a rather remarkable turnabout, the right has shifted from conservatism to right-wing populism. The one force they do trust is popular government. Facts 5, I'm here. I just want to say, for anyone who might be a bit confused with the term popular government, nowadays, popular tends to mean something a lot of people want. In this case, it's very likely he's using popular to mean its old definition, namely a government that has as many people participating in it as often as possible. In the struggle between the
hard hats, Archie bunkers, provincials, rednecks, primitives, middle Americans, and reactionaries, and the goo-goos, radical chic, limousine liberals, do-gooders, and Eastern establishment liberals,
the new right is firmly on the side of the hard hats. Facts 5, I'm back again. For anyone confused by the term goo-goo, it is not referring to babies, but rather an older term for good government. I guess it used to be a bit more popular in the late 70s. It referred to usually progressive-leaning reformer types. As the new rightists see it, these members of the silent majority have been oppressed and exploited by elitists who repaid them for past loyalties by labeling them bigots and worse. Conservatism and the masses. True conservatism has always been concerned with the conserving of values. Thoughtful intellectuals, balanced, rational, aristocratic, elitist, place such confidence in the capacity of the common man to conserve. Conservatives from Edmund Burke to Henry Adams to Irving Babbitt to T.S. Eliot to George Will have expressed a cautious disdain for the masses. The masses to them are impulsive, irrational, emotional, unappreciative of the heritage of culture that only the elite could have preserved. Yet the tumultuous circumstances of the years from the end of the Second World War to the present reshaped the face of American conservatism. They disarranged the established order, questioned established values. The rapaciousness of the populist new right in the 1970s is one result. George Nash, in The Conservative Intellectual Movement in the Americas since 1945, published in 1976, notes that
a series of Supreme Court decisions aroused not just conservative intellectuals, but broad segments of the populace which right-wingers could now at long last cultivate. These,
Nash wrote,
included policemen and law enforcement officials enraged by court decisions which protected the rights of criminals, millions of Americans who could not understand why the rights of atheists should prevent the voluntary reading of the Lord's Prayer and the Bible in public schools, Americans angry about permissiveness and court rulings on pornography, politicians astounded by the court's reapportionment decisions, and anti-communists alarmed at the court's continual blows at congressional investigations and Cold War legislation.
Campus unrest and the rise of the new left in the 60s and early 70s also alarmed many American parents, who blamed the disorder on liberal college professors and administrators, who, having nourished rebellious ideas in their young charges, lacked the will to resist when the students carried their rebellious teachings to the logical extensions of chaos. The failure of liberal intellectual leadership to cope effectively with rapid social change was in part to blame, but so was the conservative leadership that failed to participate and to safeguard against the populist revolt. The elite is the enemy. New right strategists like Kevin Phillips and Pat Buchanan in the early 70s began to realize that they need no longer be bound to the conservative image of
blue stocking republicanism,
the country club and inherited wealth, so destructive to potential coalitions with blue collar Americans. Indeed, they would demolish the structure by reversing it. Their new image would be anti-elitism. They would ride into power on the wave of class hostility by appealing to the resentment of the
forgotten Americans,
who felt exploited by those in power. Seizing on Frank Meyer's references in 1970 to the
producing majority,
William Rusher in his book The Making of the New Majority Party, 1975, produced a theory about American politics that envisioned a new alliance of producers, including
businessmen, manufacturers, hard hats, blue-collar workers, and farmers,
against
non-producers, chiefly members of the knowledge industry, the major news media, the educational establishment, the federal bureaucracy, the foundations and research centers, and a semi-permanent welfare constituency.
The conservative periodicals began to bristle with references to
verbalists, elitists, and bureaucrats.
The editors at Conservative Digest took pains to publicize local anti-busing and anti-textbook revolts against
liberal elitists.
Conservative Digest was concerned above all to raise the class consciousness of
the little people,
whose identity was never carefully defined but appeared to be mostly white and lower middle class Americans. Rightist leader Phyllis Schlafly was once referred to in its pages as a woman successful in politics despite her lack of
tie-ins to the power elite,
in a phrase lifted from the work of Marxist sociologist C. Wright Mills. At least one conservative, Hamilton Rogers, writing in The New Guard, attacked this strategy as
fundamentally anti-intellectual. It's not that pointy-headed intellectuals are not to be encouraged or kept by government. All intellectuals, the new right contends, have pointy heads. The lunchbox is glorified while the briefcase disdained. Ridicule of the socio-cultural style of the Northeast is an important means through which the new right can coalesce the alienated elements of the New Deal coalition into a pattern of political support. Constant attacks on Washington, the foundations, the media, and research institutions are the bon mots of Phillips's New Right. The New Right is, however, more than populist. It is McLuhan-era Marxism.
The New Right has urged the political uprising of one class against its oppressors that is much akin to an uprising described by Peter Viereck in his essay The Revolt Against the Elite. Viereck had analyzed McCarthyism as less concerned with the threat of communism and communists, real or imagined, than with an effort to embarrass Eastern liberal intellectuals in the universities and the government. It was a revolt of angry Americans who thought the exploits of the Wisconsin senator acted out their own feelings of inferiority and resentment of those better educated and more prestigious than they. As Viereck might put it, ex-Marxists plus status-resenting know-nothings equals right-wing populism. Both McCarthyism and the New Right caricature of Marxism are vengeful rearguard actions by Americans who feel dispossessed or overlooked. These Americans may have legitimate grievances, lacking adequate roles in the governing process. Whatever the legitimacy, their anxieties represent genuine potentials for social unrest. The New Right counsels them to reject constituted authorities. To traditional conservatives who look for inspiration to such giants as Edmund Burke, any political activity deliberately designed to fuel fires of social discord must be considered fundamentally anti-conservative and even more revolutionary. The New Right is light years away from the conservative stabilizing tradition of Disraeli and Churchill. New Right pundits have drawn much ammunition in their polemical war against the elite from the works of neoconservative writers and scholars like Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell, who, in an unwitting assist, have focused on the concept of
the new class.
The idea originated with Milovan Dijas, who argued in The New Class in 1957 that communist societies are increasingly ruled by
those who have special privileges and economic preference because of the administrative monopoly they hold.
the new right has transposed the term to apply to American society, maintaining that a ruling class, similar to which Dijals identified, has emerged, composed of bureaucrats and managers assigned by corporate capitalism to administer the welfare state and defense establishment. As the focus of the economy has evolved from production of goods to the distribution of services, with the burgeoning of the white collar class and the decline of farm workers, manual, and even skilled labor, new skills, mainly intellectual, have become increasingly essential. This professional technical elite, the new right argues, wields power and prestige undemocratically. The revulsion at the new class has led the new right into its populist attachment to the masses, an identification reinforced by certain conservative intellectuals, once on the left, who turned anti-Eastern establishment as well as anti-elite. Whittaker Chambers, an ex-communist, noted, for example, that
the plain men and women of this nation
stood by him in his great struggle against the Eastern establishment. James Burnham, after a cross-country tour in the late 40s, returned refreshed and full of hope for the common American who rejected the defeatism of the ingrown East. The political scientist Wilmore Kendall wrote of the
native good sense of the American people.
And Will Shallam wrote with pride that Senator Joseph McCarthy was a product of the presumably robust
heartland of America.
At a small party on Capitol Hill, shortly after the 1978 elections, one young right-wing activist who studied at a university in his native western state before completing his undergraduate work in the East said of
Ivy Leaguers, they think they're better than everyone else. They think their shit don't stink.
Encountering a well-known right-wing activist at a Harvard buffet some months back, I introduced myself, and he immediately confessed he was surprised to be invited, explaining,
I don't get to attend many of these Ivy League cocktail parties.
Rightists talk frequently of cocktail parties in a suspicious tone, though they, too, give parties. It seems to be assumed that at
liberal cocktail parties,
plots against the Republic are hatched. Accompanying such talk is often an inference that the lifestyles of Easterners are somewhat racier than the rightists' own, and that this decadence explains liberal political attitudes. At a dinner party in '77, I recall how, to my considerable shock, a bright and able aide to one right-wing Southern senator expressed his disdain for columnist James J. Kilpatrick on the grounds that he was
a limousine liberal, just like all the rest.
Kilpatrick, in truth, is a hopelessly square conservative who lives in the mountains of Virginia. Kendall, as early as 42, had written of his outrage at
the most gigantic and unpardonable trahison de clercs of which history offers any record. To think of it makes me sick at heart.
He once planned to write a book that would constitute
a declaration of war on the intellectuals.
Burnham attributed the riots of the 60s to
a collapse of the morale of the governing elite.
Will Herberg wrote of the defection of an uprooted intelligentsia whose self-extrusion from bourgeois society was leading it to a war against its own society. The historian Stephen Tonsor has referred to
the last hours of the great liberal ascendancy.
Jeffrey Hart, a Dartmouth scholar who writes for National Review, assaulted the
habitually antagonistic and sometimes even treasonous relationship
of the intellectuals
to their surrounding society.
Hart observed that the
adversary writers
who once railed against
respectable
society had, in an inversion, become a
mass intelligentsia
and
mass adversary culture.
In other words, the right hadn't changed, its enemy had. The new right has identified as members of the new class professors and educational administrators, research scientists working on government grants, federal bureaucrats, planners in the public and private sectors, consultants and public relations experts, national newscasters and network journalists, writers and critics. These are the pointy heads in the contemptuous view of the practical men of the new right who boast that they, in contrast, know how to meet payroll. Right of center outbursts like the movements that supported Wallace in '68 and Agnew in '72 are in large degree manifestations of this anti-intellectualism. Speeches by Wallace bristled with phrases such as
pointy-headed professors and briefcase-toting bureaucrats.
Agnew spoke out for
the great silent majority
when he blasted journalists as
an effete corps of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals.
President Nixon's popularity was at its peak in the days immediately after his great silent majority speech, when, alerted by their spokesman to the liberal taint in professional educators, conservative parents began to do battle with elementary and secondary school administrators on textbooks, curricula, and library books. They were rising in anger not only at
Arrogant educational specialists
who seemed to believe they knew better what values their children should be taught, but at educational
specialists,
who were
outsiders,
educated at prestigious universities,
invading
the communities to
impose their values
on the natives. Innovative programs were to blame. The Back to Basics movement gained new allies, ironically enough, joining the protest from black ghetto parents disgusted with decreased academic quality in their children's schools. The revolt against the values of the new class expanded its sights from schools to the national news media. Charges of biased press coverage of the Vietnam War, of the student riots, and the presidential campaigns of the late 60s and early 70s were pressed with fervor and effectiveness by Agnew and Nixon, but their dissatisfaction was only a boiling over of the resentments that had been simmering in conservative republicanism for several decades. Just as Robert Taft had lashed out against the Eastern newspapers for what he, with much reason, considered unfair coverage, so President Dwight Eisenhower, who had been the beneficiary of that coverage earlier, at the 1964 convention that nominated Barry Goldwater, ripped into
sensation-seeking columnists and commentators.
Entire books were written subsequently on the treatment of Goldwater by the news media. And in The Future of Conservatism, 1968, rightist journalist M. Stanton Evans criticized the major television networks for preoccupations with the new left and blindness to the numerically larger conservatism. In the late 60s and early 70s, a number of published studies seemed to give support to such charges of media bias. Edith Ephron's The News Twisters documented what she said was negative coverage of the Nixon '68 campaign. Ernest Lefevre of Georgetown University published a hard-hitting analysis of press coverage of the Vietnam War, widely publicized in the right-of-center circles. Howard K. Smith, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Irving Kristol, and Theodore White supported similar conclusions. As Kristol wrote in The Public Interest,
ideological bias on television newscasting was not a malicious invention of Spiro Agnew.
Despite the symbiotic relationship of the new right to the neocons, the new right's deep distrust of intellectuals in the university world, as well as its resentment of the East, has made for little sympathy or cooperation between the two groups. The new right is incapable, moreover, of accepting the conservatism of anyone who claims that description, yet it was not proven that he is an authentic conservative by embracing the movement, its personalities and its practices. The new right therefore remains suspicious of the neocons.
I do think we're better off with those people as adversaries.
Pat Buchanan said of the informal cluster of writers and scholars like Kristol, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, Seymour Martin Lipset, and Norman Podhoretz, who make up the neocon movement. Genuine intellectuals, these academics and editors have in recent years moved from liberal and even leftist views to relatively conservative ones, highly critical of the presumptions of the Great Society and a decade of detente. They have promoted in publications like The Public Interest, Commentary, and The American Spectator traditional views of the family, abortion, homosexuality, and other social questions. On many issues they have come to conclusions similar to those reached by the New Right, although they disagree on the means by which their goals should be advanced. Neocons agree that a more hawkish posture should be adopted in dealings with the Soviet Union, but they disagree with the New Right on matters of domestic and economic policies.
The American right refused in the 1930s to join the national mandate for the welfare state.
Podhoretz told me to explain the major difference between the political positions of the New Right and the neocons. Though skeptical of government's capacity to solve many social ills, the neocons nevertheless find nothing objectionable per se in the existence and maintenance of the welfare state, while the New Right seeks to dismantle much social welfare legislation. Public Interest editor Kristol, one of the few Republican neocons and a supporter of New York Congressman Jack Kemp, a conservative favorite about whom the New Right is unenthusiastic, said of Kemp,
Jack has no interest in repealing or railing against the welfare state. He grew up under it, and he has no particular animosity to its existence at all. In fact, he believes that with sufficient tax cuts we could simultaneously maintain and even increase current levels of public spending and public services by increasing production and expanding the tax base.
This attitude is rejected to a large extent by new rightists, who still favor vast reductions in government services. The neocons are also more interested, than is the new right, in the correctness of procedure with which political goals are pursued. The new right seeks immediate gratification of its political desires, exhibiting disdain for traditional procedures of representative government.
Unlike the new right, we have no interest in and little sympathy for methods of direct democracy like initiatives and referenda,
Crystal explained. But deeper resentments lurk beneath the surface. New rightists consider the neocons as elitists, which certainly they are, and therefore is not to be trusted. They do not look kindly on unabashed intellectualism that takes a greater interest in disassembling ideas than in gathering votes. The neocons, Kevin Phillip has written, are
chiefs without Indians,
ultimately irrelevant eggheads who must
seem reassuring
to establishment liberals on a number of cultural and political grounds.
Number 1. Disproportionate Eastern, even New York City origins. 2. Close identification with the intelligentsia and elite publications such as Commentary and the Public Interest. 3. Strong anti-populism and lack of grassroots political organization or interest. 4. Disproportionately Jewish antecedents and strong support for Israel. 5. Strong previous identification with the Democratic Party. 6. Support for the elitist, internationalist, institutionalist side of conservatism rather than the populist or nationalistic variety. 7. Long-standing insider involvement in Washington affairs.
Ironically, the backgrounds of certain important new right theorists are tonier than those of neocons. Buchanan studied philosophy at Georgetown, M. Stanton Evans economics at Yale, Kevin Phillips studied at Harvard and the London School of Economics. William Rusher, a New Yorker since childhood, received his law degree from Yale. The neocons, on the other hand, tend to come from lower middle-class backgrounds, educated at schools like the City College of New York. Moynihan was a Times Square shoeshine boy who spent many summers of his childhood on an Indiana farm. Podhoretz was a street kid from Brooklyn, a polemical brawler who fought his way up the New York literary and intellectual ranks. That these writers came to be associated with the academic and publishing worlds, however, put them beyond the pale for new rightists, whose deep alienation from such worlds, perhaps gained from their own experiences as right-wingers in liberal schools, suggests that the new right cannot abide potential allies who, in important respects, are not, in their terms, trustworthy. Neocons must be watched at all times lest they sabotage the cause. Hate objects of the new right. So deep is the new right's antipathy for intellectual elitists that it has prompted them to turn their guns also on genuine conservatives who, by their cultural styles, appear to the new right primitives as enemies. The most frequent target of such abuse is, of course, William F. Buckley, Jr., whose learning, cultivation, and wealth invite suspicion. Member of a rich and distinguished family, Buckley exemplifies much of what the new rightists despise. Educated in England and at Yale, he is cultured and erudite, speaking with what many new rightists suspect is an accent he has affected. Cosmopolitan in his attitudes, he has been an iconoclastic journalist, controversial and unflappable. He plays the harpsichord and paints, has been known to swear on television, and writes in a prose style that is highly individualistic and often obtuse. He prefers to use the correct word, even if it is unlikely to be understood immediately by many of his readers. He has what he calls
trans-ideological friendships
with economist John Kenneth Galbraith, historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., and journalist Murray Kempton. A member of fashionable New York society, he attends novelist Truman Capote's annual ball. Buckley's periodic deviations to the left, an endorsement of liberal Democrat Allard Lowenstein for Congress, support for the Carter administration's Panama Canal treaties, decriminalization of marijuana use, are often explained by vexed right-wingers as a contamination by Buckley's liberal friends.
Buckley spends too much time skiing with that Galbraith,
A conservative newspaper publisher once told me. Another favorite theory, this to explain Buckley's support for the Panama Canal treaties, is that the writer and debater
is under Kissinger's influence.
as though mesmerized, a reference to his friendship with the former Secretary of State. Time was when National Review, under Buckley's guidance, was the publication most responsible for drawing together the disparate elements of the political right, actively promoting the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater in '64, and covering the events and personalities of the burgeoning conservative movement of the early '60s. As Buckley became more involved in other pursuits during the mid and late '70s, writing novels, serving as a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN, his influence on the conservative community declined, making way for a new breed.
I suppose there is the feeling that I've been on the scene an awfully long time.
Buckley told me.
And maybe it is that people are just tired of the same old face. I could understand that feeling. Maybe they are looking for new faces.
Owing perhaps to Buckley's own growing weariness with right-wing politics, National Review has in recent years become increasingly indifferent to the Washington hurly-burly that is the focus of new right money and attention. As a political force one hears on Capitol Hill, National Review has become irrelevant. It has chosen to turn its interests elsewhere, Kevin Phillips said, a
nominal rightist
publication that has elected
to prance off harmlessly in pursuit of Oscar Wilde's prose, Chateau Latif's wine, and Otto von Habsburg's relevance.
At a Capitol Hill Christmas party in '78, I heard someone ask,
"Why is Buckley taking up all these liberal positions?" "Because he's all messed up on drugs,"
came the reply.
"He's been a liberal ever since."
Probing this strange and baseless notion, I was reminded that Buckley once admitted to smoking marijuana on his yacht outside the 3-mile legal limit. The addiction, about which Buckley laughs, was, from all accounts, the creation of a fervid right-wing imagination. Howard Phillips of the Conservative Caucus sums up the opinions of a growing number of activists on the right that
Buckley, for all the good work he has done, is simply not on the cutting edge of American politics anymore. His positions on legalizing marijuana and passage of the Panama Canal treaties were a great disappointment. He really isn't with us anymore.
Others note that he has mellowed in recent years, devoting more and more time to his novels and to introspective works like Airborne, published in 1976. A genuine hate object of the new right is George F. Will, the conservative columnist of the Washington Post, whose elitism offends the neo-populists. Will, a frosty and somewhat aloof highbrow, is Midwest-born but the Oxford-educated son of a professor of philosophy. He first made contact with the Washington conservative community in '68 when he took a job with Senator Gordon Allott of Oklahoma. He was almost instantaneously disliked by many right-wing activists, and when he was named Washington editor of National Review, they were outraged.
There is no question that George Will is the foremost conservative writing in America today. I identify very closely with the kind of conservatism he represents,
An American Conservative Union activist told me, but he admits to ambivalence.
When he began contributing those early pieces to the Washington Post, he demonstrated a really galling amount of opportunism. I was an aide to Senator Buckley at the time, and all too often it seemed to me that he used his credentials as National Review correspondent to trash whatever the conservatives on the Hill were doing, and I'm sure that his editors at the Post loved him for it. Once he was established and began to write a regular column, he's been very solid and very good. But I can't help but fault him for the way he got there, and I don't blame some of the conservatives who still resent him for it and don't altogether trust him.
Some deny that Will is a conservative at all. His reluctance to support the '76 candidacy of Ronald Reagan, for example, aroused much rightist hostility.
When George Will writes, should conservatives heed?
Human Events asked in 1977 and answered no.
He is frequently palmed off as a conservative by the liberal media.
Yet a less than laudatory column about Reagan
revealed, despite his once having written for National Review, that he is about as conservative as, well, Nelson Rockefeller, whom Will used to trumpet as being in the conservative tradition until he thought it opportune to knife him.
Will is less critical of federal government power and spending than Human Events wanted him to be, and that
should lay to rest any suspicions about the genuineness of his conservative faith.
Especially dastardly, he is
a stout champion of liberal Republicans.
His
liberal positions are legion. Do we think George Will is a conservative?
Asked Battle Line.
Let's put it this way. If he is, then every other conservative we know isn't.
Will, however philosophically conservative, is
not really one of us.
To quote a favorite line of right-wing activists. The New Right's discomfort with William Safire, who has proved to be one of the best investigative reporters in the business, and certainly the only one on the conservative side, is the result, to some extent, of the role he performed in modifying the Nixon administration's ideology. Human Events attacked him shortly after publication of his memoirs of those years, before the fall, 1975, for he frequently clashed with Pat Buchanan, who was pushing Nixon to the right. Sapphire, adhering to the notion that
the political center is the place to be,
prevailed with Nixon. Human Events wrote that,
for helping to turn the president leftward, one supposes, Sapphire wound up as a columnist for the New York Times. Curiously, the Times sells Sapphire's column to other publications as a representative of conservative opinion. As flax go, Sapphire is one of the best,
wrote Kevin Phillips.
How Sapphire came to the New York Times is amusing and informative. Publisher Punch Sulzberger says he was hired as a conservative spokesman. The New York Times does not want a genuine conservative, of course. It wants a White House PR man to serve as half a fig leaf.
Sapphire, in fairness to his critics, but also to himself, was never associated with the right wing of the Republican Party. When he went to the White House, he was known as a Rockefeller partisan, but the attacks on Sapphire give one the definite impression that his association with the New York Times is in itself part of the problem. The New Right's rejection of Buckley, Will, and Sapphire as authentic spokesmen for conservative values demonstrates the corrosive character of its anti-elitist, anti-intellectual stance. It feeds on resentment and to some degree on envy, and smacks of an egalitarianism that is the exact opposite of all that true conservatives stand for. Its vengeful attitude reflects the deep alienation that the new rightists feel toward both those below them on the socioeconomic level and those above them. It is the ideology of the insecure who want to salve those insecurities by a leveling process. Their intent is the fomenting of class warfare.